The first successful experience that I had with this technique actually came after a number of failed attempts, which seems totally typical because you're basically practicing. Just like, the first few times you get on a surfboard, you're going to fall down. I probably practiced for about 6 weeks, I would say. Maybe not necessarily daily, but almost daily. So the first successful experience happened on August 23rd, 2020. So I began with the initial process described in the first video, where through awareness and intention, you're kind of self-stimulating this vision that in my case was the violet flame, which became more and more intense. And when it got to a certain intensity, it was as if from that point, from this violet flame, I could jump to some other place. I didn't know where I was going to end up when I did that jumping, and I wasn't even necessarily aware of doing the jumping. It's more like at some point in this violet flame, I just got transported to some other place. And I wasn't really very conscious of how I got to that place. It was almost like I blacked out, although I didn't black out. It was like a moment of nothingness, and then boom, I was someplace else. Now, I don't know if that's just because my memory wasn't capable of holding on to whatever that experience was that transported me, or if the nature of that transport is such that there is nothing to remember. In any case, I found myself in another world, floating over a dark, seemingly dead and abandoned landscape of a formerly inhabited planet. Housing structures were all well below ground level, with only a small window and the roofs sticking above the ground, but like a foot above the ground. The landscape was incredibly harsh and dry, and there was very little light, at least where I was. And there was no sign of a past. It was just these houses, but nothing else. No signs of any kind of infrastructure or, buildings above ground. So I got the sense that at one point, this was an inhabited planet. It didn't have an atmosphere, so for some reason it died. And these structures, who knows how old they were? They could have been millions of years old if it's just on a dead planet floating in space. I have no idea where. Or, for that matter, I have no idea when. So after floating around like a drone, like a hovercraft, I'm just kind of floating around the surface, looking for something that would give an indication of what went on here, or what happened. Yeah, I just ended up wanting to leave. And just that desire, just the intention of wanting to leave, I found myself back where I started. I would say I was back where I was when I was in the violet flame, but this time I didn't see the flame. But it just felt like that's where I was. And then, again, the desire to go further sent me someplace else. And this time, I was in a dark cave at night. And the roof of the cave had a large hole in it through which I could see the night sky. And it was extremely beautiful. It was full of stars. And I wanted to go out of the hole. And so I tried to, through intention, move myself up, which worked until I got to the hole in the roof of the cave, and then I was blocked. I could not get through that hole. Something blocked me. I don't know what. I just know I couldn't get out. And I would return to this cave in future experiences, and I would see kind of, I guess what we could say, an evolution or a transition or a new perspective from inside the cave, and eventually I would be able to get out of that hole into that sky. Like before, I exited, came back to the launch pad, I guess we'll call it, and then re-entered again. And this time I found myself in some city park in the middle of the day. It was bright. There were people gathered around for some sort of march. There were buildings. All in all, a fairly typical day in a nice, clean, big city on a what looked like a summer day. I stayed there for a little while, kind of looking around. And I remember actually in that experience, I remember very clearly that I was looking through, I guess, what we could consider as a pair of eyes. Unlike the other experiences where I was observing something, but it didn't seem limited by eyes. That's the best I can explain it. But this time, it's like I was in a person. I was in a body. Or maybe a virtual projection of my own, kind of like an astral body. But I don't think I was in an astral state. I mean, maybe I was in like another plane, but I still kind of like identified with my body. So I was looking through what felt like eyes. I don't know if this was a physical location. It could have been, some other dimensional city where people, I guess, do the same thing we do in the cities. Or it could have been maybe somebody's body that I just kind of popped into without any understanding of what I was doing. But I was in a body looking through my eyes at all the stuff that was going on. I exited that, came back to the launch pad, and exited one more time. And this time I found myself, again, like the planet experience, I was kind of flying or floating near the surface, but I didn't feel like I was controlling that direction. Felt like I was being moved. And this was somewhere in the country, like farmland. The best image to explain it is the painting of Andrew Wyeth called Christina's World, which is just a lone house on this big open field, kind of slightly on a hill. It's a pretty famous painting. But that's the kind of landscape that I was traveling through. But I also had a limited vision. It was like I was looking through a small window, like a welder's glass window. Like it was a small rectangular field of vision. And I'm trying to control my direction, and I can't. It's like I'm being moved, not so much against my will, but my will seemed to have no effect on where I was moving. I kept trying to navigate, and I finally realized that I could control my direction. It wasn't just my direction that I couldn't control. I couldn't control my field of vision. Like I couldn't turn my head left or right. It's like I was being shown the vision and I had no control over it. But I did ultimately end up finding a way to change the field of vision. And that was by focusing my intention on an object that was passing, for example. And I didn't try to change my field of view. I just changed my attention. Like I anchored my attention at a particular point. Like maybe there was a rock or there was a mailbox there, for example. We passed a mailbox, or I passed a mailbox, but it felt like we because something else was moving me. So on passing the mailbox, I focused my attention on the mailbox and I kept my awareness at that point. And then as we passed, my field of vision changed so that the mailbox remained in the center of my vision. So there had to be a focal point that I could put my attention on. And then I could change my view to whatever I want as long as there was something to focus on, which I thought was kind of very interesting later, which is typically, we turn our heads to look at something to put our attention on. And this was kind of the opposite. You had to put your attention on the thing first, and then it turned your head, quote unquote. I don't know if I had a head, but it shifted your field of vision. It was kind of like the opposite of what we're typically used to doing here in our physical bodies. I exited that location and I came back to that core place. I found the violet light again, but it was very weak. but I began to see a form of a tetrahedron that was black or had some shadows on it. And then all of a sudden, like a flood of other shapes followed. It was like a tsunami of shapes, three-dimensional shapes. And then the violet light got very strong and started coming in from different angles and different sources, which was a first, because I had never seen before the violet light to come in from what appeared to be external sources. It was always something I had created or enhanced in the center of my vision. But now they're coming in from the left and the right, top, bottom. And in that moment, I began to hear a woman's voice explaining things to me. And it's so frustrating because I don't remember what she said. After a few moments of this intense violet light, my consciousness simply shut down. It was like passing out, because the next thing I knew, I'm just back in normal space. Now, in all of these experiences, the whole time, I never went into, I guess you would say, an altered consciousness. I was in my room. I could hear everything going on. I could move my body. While I'm in these experiences, if I had an itch, I could scratch it. If I wanted to move my legs, I could move my legs. And I didn't lose this connection. It wasn't a deep state of like meditation or transcendence. I could have had a conversation with somebody while this was going on. I could have been explaining what I was seeing as I was seeing it. I didn't lose any connection with my physical body. This ability to stay connected to my physical body would get tested the next day when it was a sunny day. So I went up to my rooftop, which is a flat terrace, and sat in the sun. I think I took my shirt off because it was spring. And there's a little garden up there, and I put a band around my eyes so that the sun wasn't super bright in my eyes. There was a little bit of light coming through, but very little. And I did this same technique over again. And this time, maybe because I was in the sun, I began to see small yellow targets, which is the opposite of violet. But this is very rare. There's only a couple of times that have happened, and I'm not sure why. As I began to focus on these and kind of traveled down that path, I began to see a big eye, like a human eye, kind of come into shape. And inside that eye, there was a bunch of violet light inside the eye. And with the more focusing, I could see that the eye was connected to a face. And eventually I could see half of the whole face because it was kind of slightly angled. And it was a very old face. And it looked very fierce, but it was very beautiful. And as I continued to focus on it, the eye remained, and I ended up seeing a large black triangle with the eye inside it. And I immediately started to think, okay, this is like too on the nose. I'm seeing a triangle with an eye in it. Like, is the Illuminati somehow visiting me or something? I mean, I don't put a lot of weight on that kind of stuff. But this one was so obviously clear that I thought, well, maybe it's just a pattern in my head because I have seen it so much before. Or maybe it is one of those archetypal images, which kind of makes more sense. And it's just been hijacked by, various groups that like its symbolism or something. But while I'm doing this, my housemate came up to the roof and started tending to the garden. And she started talking to me, not knowing I was, doing a meditation or anything. She just saw me sitting there in a chair. And I started talking back to her. So I'm having a conversation with her while I'm going to wherever I'm going, seeing these strange symbols and faces. But oddly, I actually couldn't go any further. There were no paths available or open, and it just seemed like a dead end. I couldn't go any further. I was kind of stuck in this place, and then I was just kind of bored. So I ended it and continued my conversation with my housemate. Looking back, for me, the most significant part of this experience, and the one before as well, was it showed how the consciousness can be in two places at the same time. Typically, our consciousness is focused here in our physical reality, or if we do some meditation or other practices, we kind of go to another reality. Our consciousness is focused on another, spectrum of reality that we're immersed in. But in this case, it's both at the same time. It's like you're widening the abilities of your consciousness so that it can actually see two realities, I guess we'll call it, at the same time and deal with them. Fine. The example used earlier was, the spectrum. You see red, you see green, but if you zoom out, you can see red and green. And they aren't conflicting with each other. You're like, oh my God, how can two things that are opposite each other exist together? When it makes perfect sense. Once you can zoom out, once your awareness widens so that it can see the red and green part of the spectrum. That's what this felt like.